They expected you to break first. They expected the silence to get uncomfortable for you, not for them. They expected that sooner or later you would reach out, check in, try to fix it like you always did. But this time, you didn't. And when an avoidant sees you again after that long silence, something happens immediately. Something they don't show directly, but they feel it instantly. Because they're not just seeing you. They're seeing the version of you that didn't come back. Have you ever experienced that moment? You stop texting, you stop chasing, you finally pull your energy back, and then suddenly you cross paths again. Maybe it's random. Maybe it's planned. But the energy feels different. Not warm, not cold, just unfamiliar. Like something invisible has shifted between you. If you've felt that, stay with this, because what's really happening in that moment goes deeper than most people understand, and most people completely misread it. Avoidants are not emotionless. That's the first thing you need to understand. They feel deeply, but they manage those feelings by controlling distance. When things get too close, too intense, too real, they don't move toward it. They move away. Not because they stopped caring, but because closeness makes them feel like they're losing control. And control is everything to them. So they create space, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. And when they create that space, something else happens. You usually try to close it. You text. You check in. You try to understand. You try to bring things back to how they were. And without realizing it, you enter a pattern, distance. Then you chase. Then they return. Then things feel okay again. And then it repeats. It feels like connection, but it's actually a loop. And here's where it gets interesting, because most people never step out of that loop. But you did. You stopped chasing. You went silent. And this is where it changes. Because when you remove your role in that pattern, you don't just create distance, you create uncertainty. And uncertainty is something avoidants are not comfortable with. They are used to controlling how much connection exists. They are used to knowing that even if they pull away, you'll eventually come back. That certainty keeps their emotional world stable. But when you don't come back, something shifts inside them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and immediately. So when they see you again after that silence, the first thing they do is not reconnect. They observe. They look at you differently. They listen more carefully. They try to read your energy without asking direct questions. Because now, they don't know where they stand with you. And this is where most people miss what's really happening. They think they're acting normal, so nothing changed. But something did change. You did. And now, they have to figure out what that means. But something else happens too. Something even more important. They start to feel a lack of control. Not in an obvious way, not like panic, but in a subtle internal way. The kind of feeling where something is slightly off and they can't quite place it. Because before, they understood the dynamic. Now they don't. And this is where it gets deeper. Avoidants rely on predictability. If they know how you will respond, they can manage their own emotions. They can decide how close to get, when to pull back, how much to invest. But when you become unpredictable, you disrupt that system. And when that system is disrupted, they don't immediately move closer. They slow down. They analyze. They become more aware of you than before, even if they don't show it. And this is the part most people miss. It's not about what they say. It's about what they start noticing. Your tone, your calmness, your lack of urgency, your emotional independence. And all of that sends a message without you saying a single word. I'm not the same. And that message lands immediately. But something else happens here, something even more subtle. They begin to feel curiosity. Not the kind that shows up as excitement, but the kind that quietly pulls their attention toward you. The kind that makes them think about you later. The kind that makes them wonder, what changed? And this is where most people make a mistake. They feel that slight shift, and they rush back in. They start chasing again. They try to turn that moment into something more. But the moment you do that, the pattern resets. Because now everything is predictable again, and the avoidant relaxes back into distance. But if you don't, if you stay grounded, if you keep that calm, detached energy, something else begins to happen. And this is where it gets really interesting. Because now they start adjusting to you, not the old you, the new one, and that creates a completely different dynamic. But most people never get to see this part, because they don't hold the silence long enough. They break it too early. They go back too fast. They try to fix something that was actually working in their favor, and this is where it changes everything. But something else happens here that almost no one talks about. And this is where it changes in a way that most people completely underestimate. because what looks like nothing happening on the surface is actually a quiet shift in control underneath. When you don't rush back in, when you don't fill the silence, when you don't try to recreate the old connection, the avoidant has to sit with something they usually escape, their own feelings, not because they suddenly became more emotional, but because there's no longer a distraction. Before, your chasing gave them space to stay passive. They didn't have to question anything. They didn't have to initiate. They didn't have to feel the weight of the connection because you were carrying it. But now, that weight doesn't disappear. It shifts. And this is where most people miss the real psychological turning point. Because when an avoidant feels something without control, they don't express it immediately. They process it, slowly, internally. And this is where it changes. They start replaying interactions, small moments. The way you spoke, the way you looked at them, the fact that you didn't react the way you used to, and it creates a quiet tension inside them. Not because they stopped caring, but because they can't define what you are to them anymore. An uncertainty creates a tension. For example, imagine this. You see them again in a group setting. Before, you would naturally gravitate toward them. Your attention would be focused. Your energy would subtly signal interest. But now, you're present but not focused on them. You talk to others. You smile. You move freely. And they notice. Not immediately in an obvious way, but gradually. Their eyes check in on you. They listen when you speak to someone else. They become aware of your presence without you trying. And this is where it changes. Because now, attention is no longer one-sided. But something else happens too. They begin to compare. Not consciously like a checklist, but emotionally. They compare how you are now to how you were before. And that contrast creates impact. Before, your energy may have felt intense, reaching, slightly dependent. Now it feels stable, grounded, self-contained. And that difference makes them feel something they're not used to feeling in connection. Respect, not because you demanded it, but because you stopped overgiving. And this is where deeper psychology comes in. If you look at this through the lens of Carl Jung, what's happening is not just behavioral, it's internal. The avoidant is facing parts of themselves they've kept in the background. The need for connection, the discomfort of not being in control, the realization that someone they were used to keeping at a distance is no longer standing there in the same way. And those parts don't disappear. They rise, but they don't rise as clarity. They rise as tension. And this is why their behavior might seem confusing. One moment, they're engaged, slightly open, curious. The next moment, they pull back again. And this is where most people misinterpret things. They think nothing changed, but something did. They just don't understand the timing. Because avoidants don't move in a straight line. They move in waves, closer, then distance, then closer again. But something else is different now. Before, the pattern was controlled by them. Now, it's influenced by you. Not because you're doing more, but because you stopped doing what kept the pattern alive. And this is where it gets even more interesting. They may start testing you, not in a manipulative way necessarily, but in a subtle, almost unconscious way. They might bring up something from the past. They might ask a casual question that has emotional weight behind it. They might slightly open the door, just enough to see if you walk through it the same way as before. And this is where everything can either shift forward or fall back. Because if you respond the same way, you reset the pattern. But if you stay grounded, if you respond without over-investing, if you stay emotionally present but not dependent, something else happens. They start adjusting their behavior, not dramatically, not instantly, but gradually. And this is the part that most people never experience, because they don't hold that position long enough. Now imagine this second scenario. For example, you run into them one-on-one. No distractions, no group energy, just you and them. Before, this would have felt intense. You might have felt pressure to say the right thing, to reconnect, to fix the distance. But now, you're calm. You're present. You're not trying to get anything from the interaction. And they feel that immediately, because there's no pressure in your energy, no expectation behind your words. And that does something unexpected. It lowers their guard. Not fully, not instantly, but enough. Because for the first time, being around you doesn't feel like a demand. It feels neutral, and neutrality is safe. But something else happens here, something deeper. They begin to associate you with ease instead of pressure. And this is where the dynamic truly starts to shift. Because avoidants don't move closer to intensity. They move closer to safety. And safety is not created by chasing. It's created by emotional stability. And when you carry that consistently, They start to feel drawn in a way they don't fully understand. But here's the part you need to hear clearly. This does not mean they suddenly become emotionally available. It means the dynamic becomes real. No illusion, no imbalance, just two people, without a script. And this is where your internal shift matters the most. Because if you're still hoping they change, you'll feel pulled back into the old pattern. But if you've actually changed, you won't need them to. And that's the difference. Because now you're not reacting, you're choosing. And that choice changes everything. But something else happens here that most people completely miss. And it's the part that decides how this story ends. And this is the part that quietly decides everything. Not what they do next, but what you do when you finally see clearly. Because by now, something inside you has shifted. You're no longer trying to decode every move. You're no longer waiting for a sign. You're watching, but you're not chasing. And that changes how you interpret everything that happens next. When an avoidant sees you again after a long silence, they don't suddenly transform into someone expressive, open, and emotionally consistent. That's not how this works. What they do instead is much more subtle, but much more revealing. They begin to move closer in controlled ways, not dramatic gestures, not big emotional conversations, but small, deliberate steps. A longer conversation than usual, a slightly deeper question, a moment where they stay present instead of pulling away too quickly. And this is where it changes again, because now the connection is no longer being pulled by you. It's being tested by them. But something else happens at the same time, something that most people overlook because they're too focused on getting a result. They hesitate. Even as they move closer, there's a part of them that holds back. You might feel it in their pauses, in the way they shift topics just when things get a little real, in how they open up slightly, then pull it back. And this creates confusion if you're not grounded, because it feels like mixed signals. But it's not mixed, it's layered. One part of them is curious, another part is cautious. One part feels drawn to the new version of you, another part is trying to protect the old version of themselves. And this is where most people fall back into the pattern. They see that slight opening, and they rush in. They try to turn that small shift into something bigger. They push for clarity. They try to define the connection again. And the moment they do that, the avoidant pulls back. Not because they stopped caring, but because the pressure returned. And pressure is what they've always been avoiding. But if you don't do that, if you stay where you are, something else happens. The connection starts to rebuild, without force. Slowly, naturally, without intensity. And this is where the real transformation takes place, not in them, but in you. Because now you see things differently. You're not impressed by small effort. You're not emotionally pulled by inconsistency. You're observing patterns instead of reacting to moments. And that awareness gives you control. Not control over them, control over yourself. And that's where everything changes. Because the truth is, the moment you stop chasing an avoidant, you don't just change the dynamic. You expose it. You see it for what it really is. The push, the pull, the distance, the return. The cycle becomes visible. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. And this is where your power actually comes from. Not from making them come back. Not from getting a reaction, but from no longer needing one. Because now you're not asking, will they choose me? You're asking, do I even want this as it is? And that question changes your position completely. Because for the first time, you're not trying to fit into their emotional structure. You're deciding whether their structure fits you. And that's a different mindset, a stronger one, a clearer one. Now imagine this final scenario. You see them again, maybe weeks later, maybe months. The energy is calm, familiar but different. They talk to you. You talk back. There's no tension, no pressure, no unspoken expectation. And in that moment, something becomes obvious. You're not waiting anymore. You're not hoping. You're not trying to create something that isn't naturally there. You're just present. And that presence is what they feel the most. Not your words, not your past, not your effort, just your energy. And that's the one thing they can't control. Because before, your energy was predictable. Now, it's not. And unpredictability creates respect. But here's the deeper realization, the one most people never reach. The goal was never to make the avoidant come closer. The goal was to stop losing yourself in the process of trying. Because the moment you stop chasing, you don't just change how they see you. You change how you see yourself. And once that happens, everything becomes clearer. You recognize when someone is emotionally available. You recognize when someone is consistent. You recognize when something feels right, without effort. And you also recognize when it doesn't. So, when an avoidant sees you again after a long silence, yes, they will feel the difference immediately. They will observe you. They will adjust. They may even move closer in subtle ways. But the real question is no longer about them. It's about you, because now you're in a position you weren't in before. You're not reacting. You're choosing. And when you're in that position, you don't chase clarity anymore. You live in it. And that's the part most people miss. It was never about making them understand you. It was about you finally understanding the dynamic and choosing differently. Because once you stop chasing, you don't just break the pattern. You break the version of yourself that stayed in it. And that's not just a shift in connection. That's a shift in identity. And once that shift happens, you don't go back. Not because you can't, but because you finally see what it was costing you. And now, you're no longer willing to pay that price.